All right, we have a lot of catching up to do because I have the computer down. These are the fact sheets for the Mishima chart. And these are photos for the Mishima chart. The one on the second page didn't come out well, does it? But it's such a beautiful photo. It's him practicing or demonstrating the technique for Harakari. These are the Mishima personality traits.
I think that's one, right? Yeah. Yeah, but it's stapled together, isn't it?
No.
Oh.
This is the Ethel Barrymore brief. A lot of pictures tonight.
Thank you.
This is the Yates fact sheet. One trashy one off the side.
I didn't get the Barrymore brief yet.
Barrymore.
These are the photo sheets for Yates.
Thank you.
And this is the brief for Yates. The brief for Yates is pretty much different than what we're going to do tonight in the oral part. All right, how are we doing? All right. When we looked at the Barrymore chart 2 weeks ago, we mentioned that all of the Aries signs have to do with learning and various learning techniques. And with Barrymore, when she had Libra rising, we said that that was the method of comparison. With an earlier chart, we mentioned that contrast was associated with Gemini, which has that bipolar effect. This time we have the final air sign, which is Aquarius. So we can mention a little bit about acquiring knowledge a la Aquarius. As with many things, Aquarius has two main ways of learning. The first relates to the upper lightning stroke, the Uranus lightning stroke, and it represents an immediate intuitive apprehension of the truth. The second method is associated more with the lower lightning stroke, and it is learning by wholes. You know the whole or the entirety of something. However, at present, what our consciousness as it is now, it's not feasible for us to understand the whole of anything. To say nothing of knowing about the whole of all knowledge. So in lieu of that total apprehension, we have various Aquarian ways to approach that goal. And one of the ways that we try to get the idea of a whole is through survey, and then with working with statistics and with probability, we get a general idea of things. However, statistics and probabilities are computational methods. And it seems silly to try and describe a personality as a computational method, so we can't say that William Butler Yeats is that. But there is a word that does describe the Aquarian knowledge, or trying to learn immense amounts of information. Sometimes Aquarians seem to know just about everything about every subject. And even if they don't, they think they do. But the word that describes Aquarius is erudition. William Butler Yeats was erudite. He had enormous amounts of information on many subjects. Since we're dealing with his personality, we're going to have to deal with his erudition because that was part of his personality, and we're going to be talking about that a lot tonight. He also had the Aquarian intuition, so things seemed to come to him naturally. Beyond that, he worked exceedingly hard, not only at learning things, but how to actually learn, and how to learn things better, and how to do things faster. When we look at the fact sheet, or when we look at the planetary estimation sheet, we find Saturn is the strongest planet in the horoscope. And it's the co-ruler of the ascendant, and most likely it is the life ruler altogether. Saturn in this chart then shows that he's diligent, he's sincere, and he's very, very hardworking. Saturn rules concentration, which is a skill that Yeats practiced very early on in his life, when he was just a very young man. One of the best examples of his Saturn training, self-training, is he did something that very few people can do. But from when he was a youth, he trained himself to bring himself to total silence whenever there were verbal interactions that became uncontrolled or rude or boisterous or chaotic, and especially if they were attacking. He trained himself to remain absolutely silent no matter what any other person or people said. That's a really great Saturnine discipline. Yeats was a mystic. And as a mystic, he knew and he believed that there were paranormal ways of learning things faster and better. For his entire life, he cultivated unfolding these skills. And sometimes he even joined various different esoteric groups. He didn't give up conventional means of learning, and he studied assiduously, whether it was the occult things or whether it was regular things. Now, mystical literature is one of the examples of his fields of broad erudition. He read a lot. He read about Tibetan philosophy, about Indian philosophy and mysticism. He read an enormous amount of Greek philosophy, including Neoplatonism. He read a lot about early Rosicrucianism and alchemy. He read a lot of Swedenborg. He read a lot of Christian Kabbalism. And he studied a lot of magic, symbolic magic, ritual magic, and practical forms of magic. He read a lot of theosophy. And he was probably one of the most eclectic students of his time. He studied psychic phenomena with the different schools of psychic phenomena in Britain. He was probably more well-read on any of these particular topics than all of us put together. And yet he was very well-read in all of them. He put these things in his poetry and in his writings. We're going to come back to this. It's going to be kind of circular. We're going to keep coming back to these things again and again. So he had to know. So with Saturn and with the Sun and the Moon and the co-rulers of the ascendant, all in a grand trine of the Aries signs, he had to know everything in every possible way. He had every leg of the Aries signs covered. Now, not all of his erudition was in mystical subjects. And that brings us to another of his studies and another facet of his personality. Some of his study was not in mysticism, but in the allied field of folklore and mythology. Now, he was part of a transplant family. For many centuries, the peoples of England and Ireland fought with each other. There were a lot of wars between the British Isles and Ireland. A few years ago, when we were doing the mythology courses, we did the Mabinogion. And we studied, as part of that, the mythical war between the Welsh and the Irish. That was replete with wraiths and demons and all kinds of things like that. Currently, in Northern Ireland, we have the struggle between the Catholics and the Protestants. The IRA are nationalistic people wanting an Irish republic that is completely free from any kind of British influence. Protestants are sometimes called the Orangemen, and they're loyal to Britain. And they want freedom to maintain that loyalty and to maintain Protestant views of life. This same struggle was going on throughout Ireland in Yeats's life, especially his early years. Over the centuries, it was usually the British that prevailed, and they were a bigger country. However, there were not enough of them to completely occupy Ireland, even if that was their desire, which it never really seemed to be. So instead, they ruled by having British outposts and British representatives established in Ireland. And around those outposts, all kinds of other British people developed little communities. Now, over time, because there was a common language, many of the British people became so assimilated into Irish culture that they identified themselves more as Irish than as British. The Yeats family was one of those families, especially in his mother's side. They thought they were Irish. So he grew up in a family with a lot of tradition. And with Saturn being the stronger ruler of the ascendant, you would expect that there would be a lot of tradition in his early childhood. There was Irish folklore, Irish history, all of those things. When he grew up as a child, he believed all of the fairy stories. He loved singing or chanting Irish poetry. In fact, a lot of his own early poetry was chanted like Irish poetry. I have a sample of it, and I couldn't get it ready for tonight, but eventually we'll listen to some of his singing his own poetry. So he was immersed in Irish culture. His father was a bit more traditionally British. His father was a lawyer who later dedicated his entire life to painting, which he could afford to do because William's mother was from a very wealthy merchant family. So the family moved back and forth between England and Ireland, and there were even times when they had stays on the continent proper. So all of this taken together describes the early childhood and background of his personality. Now, I don't mean to say that his personality was a product of his environment, but we can never escape our environment. It's always going to be part of us, even though we may have brought a lot of our personality along from a past life. A pure mystic who believes that everything comes from within would say he was born where he could most work out his character or his personality from the past, but he got a lot of influence in this life. The two views don't have to be contradictory to each other. The argument between nature and nurture, astrology can swing either way and usually incorporates both. In my own working with horoscopes over the years, I've noted that when there is interest in ethnic things, in folk things, it is usually one of two signs that is prominent, if not both signs. I had several times in life when I hung out with folkniks and folk musicians, lived with them, hung out at all the clubs and things like that. The two signs that have most to do with ethnic things or folk things are Cancer and Aquarius. When Cancer is the significator, it's almost as if the ethnic traits are inbred, and if they aren't, the person tries to make them that way. As if a person were born as a folk soul. In such a case, one really is an ethnic because they are born to it. They, it's unconsciously part of them. True ethnicity is part of either a tribal or a racial or a national or a cult spirit, living through all of the beings within that particular kind of cult. It's a peculiar thing, but when American folk musicians immerse themselves in folk music or in ethnic music, they'll often take on these characteristics of the cultures, including the clannishness. I don't like the Cancerian types of folk musicians because they get all involved with clannishness. They have the in-group, out-group sympathies and antipathies that clannish groups usually have. People like this who acquire a folk consciousness bemoan the fact that they really can't be more of the real thing. They'd like to go back and be born as Native Americans or something like that and be the real thing. When Aquarius is involved with the study of ethnic things, it's a matter of internationalism. In an Aquarian attitude of humanitarianism and of humanism, and in a spirit of fairness, there's a belief that one should respect the differences common to all of humanity and find all of humanity, especially through those differences. Obviously, when you're conscious of the whole humanity and the self-consciously respecting the differences, there's a degree of removal. The very fact that you're respecting means that you're not really close to them. So there's a kind of an Aquarian aloofness in people who practice this kind of ethnic study. It's anything but the Cancerian stickiness. When Cancer gets involved, it's pretty sticky. This is so even if one is not extremely removed. The extremely removed people are like cultural anthropologists or ethnographers who make a point of staying out of things. Now, some people have both tendencies, and when they do, it's very difficult to live out both tendencies. Now, because Yeats had the moon in the first house, it indicates that in his childhood, he was something like a folk child of Ireland. And with the Aquarian ascendant and the strong airy nature, all of those planets in that grand trine, he was an ethnographer almost of the people. So in his childhood, he lived as much in the fairy world as he did in the material world. And even in his late childhood, with his uncle particularly, they practiced telepathy to see who could pass pictures or symbols or words to each other. It was almost like every family has its games and its things that they do. This is what he did. Moreover, he had a maternal grandfather that was a Saturnian patriarch. And the patriarch was very in touch with Irish culture. And so little William was both enthralled by his culture, but he was totally afraid of him in his patriarchal power and all of that. In many of the poems, especially, he never abandoned it throughout life, but in many of his early poems, he wrote like an Irish poet, and he chanted them almost like a bard. Eventually, the Aquarian side of his character won out, because the moon is not a really strong planet. And since Saturn is the co-ruler of Aquarius and is very, very strong, the colder, the more deliberating and controlling qualities had to win out over the moon. The moon is trine to Saturn, the ruler of the ascendant, and it is a first trine. So the moon receives all of its energy from Saturn in the first place. So Saturn dominates and controls in the 8th house behind the scenes, and it's giving its energies to the moon and taking over. The moon in the first house is immediate, and it gets on in early childhood. And it's got a significant jump on the personality, because Saturn is always slow to begin. However, it is the planet of the lowest degree in that grand trine between Moon, Sun, Uranus, and Saturn. And that implies that as it culminates with each of those other planets, it gets more aired out, and it gets more dried out, until ultimately the last trine of the whole bunch is the one to Uranus, which is certainly the most Aquarian planet, and by then he is completely aquarified or aerated, or however you want to say it. Now, all of this parallels what happens in his life. And we're going to look at that parallel from several ways, because it's a really important thing. If you start working with a chart and you see a pattern that repeats itself again and again and again on parallel levels, you have a good idea of understanding how a person is going to function in a given circumstance. And if you're helping them through the horoscope, if you understand that, you've got a big advantage. Since this is obviously a Saturn-ruled Aquarius, the Saturn is going to rule out. But if we start looking at his life, he begins as a folk being, an extension of the folk soul. As the family moves around, he has more and more cosmopolitan experiences. And then he begins to see things more in terms of humanity in general. Parallel to that, he switches from psychic phenomena and fairy lore and trying to see the fairies. He gradually shifts all the way to a mysticism of a universal spirit. And so all of his views change along the way. The ultimate importance that Saturn has in this horoscope and in this life should never be underestimated, or it should never be neglected. So, with time, with age, and with maturity, the Saturn things assert themselves quite strenuously in every part of his life, especially in his personality. So whether it is in a short-term phase of his life or in his life in general, his careful judgment is always going to get stronger, and it's always going to prevail. Self-consciousness is ruled by the sun, and freedom is ruled by Aquarius and Uranus. They're involved in this when he self-consciously, with the sun trine to Saturn, chooses deliberate judgment. And when his intuition is subject to and dependent on concentration, penetration, and judgment. In general, even though there is great discipline to the Saturn, what happens is he attains freedom. It sounds funny, it sounds almost paradoxical, but freedom comes because he has this great control and because he can limit himself. So, the personality with Aquarius rising is a personality with great breadth. It's filled with intellectual sophistication. But he has a personal intimacy with information. He can even feel the truth in a psychic kind of way, and that takes him away from the very things he's in touch with to a detachment. So very much of the fellowship that he had with other people spiritually or culturally or literally or politically, he was not really intimate, nor did he stay intimate in personal ways with the people that he worked with. He didn't even allow himself the intimacy of a marriage until he was 52 years old. And then he married a woman who was 26, half his age. We're coming to that. We got a long way to go. We're on page 3 of 18 pages of notes. No. We're about a quarter of the way, third of the way through. Writing is one of the most unnatural things that we as human beings do. It's artificial and it's abstractly removed from nature. We have a voice to speak, but we have to force our hand to write. And the writing is different than what it portrays. The moon is the planet that most represents nature. So if we follow this line of thought that we've been pursuing, the folk intimacy of the moon is almost akin to instinct, almost as if you were part of a group spirit or an underling to a group spirit. And it's almost like, in some ways it was, a biological intimacy. Now, humans are called rational beings because they think. And in thinking, they come to know who the thinker is. That is the God that does the thinking. The human state in thought is closer to divinity than it is to the animal state of nature or to that instinctual state. Sometimes we as human beings carry that much too far. Try to put ourselves outside of nature completely, and we try to put ourselves over nature even though we don't fully understand it, and thus we do dangerously destructive things to both nature and to our personalities that are connected to nature. In short, we become too artificial. The air signs are called intellectual signs because this kind of thought activity that's associated with them does lead us to a spiritual kind of intellection. So as we've just seen, it takes Yeats out of his personal outlooks into something much higher. Now this works throughout the evolution of the personality of Yeats. The best example being his writing. He was a Nobel laureate for poetry. And he was definitely given the Nobel Prize for his early poetry. And that was Irish poetry. He was tremendously lyric. However, the more he studied, and the deeper he studied, the more abstract and airy his poetry became. All of the lyrical works contain some of the Irish quality, but with each successive one there were more and more abstract things, especially when he started studying Neoplatonism. He tried to include Neoplatonism into his poetry. He was a complete man of letters. He wrote novels, he wrote plays, and he wrote nonfiction, feeling that there were not enough venues or encouragement for literary people around. He used his first house strength to be a founder. He founded the Irish Literary Society, the National Literary Society of Ireland, the Irish Academy of Letters, the Abbey Theatre, and the Irish Literary Theatre. This is a busy, busy man. This indicates how big the scope of this intellect this man is. These things illustrate a point about the nature of his personality, which we're seeing in many ways, in many facets in his character. He began with psychic phenomena and folklore. He never stayed there. His moon was impressionable enough that he could have stayed there. But through thought and intellection, he became increasingly depersonalized. If he had not begun with his personal experience, if he had not begun with the moon in the first house, he would have been pedantic. He would have been irrelevant, like scholars and intellectual people can often be. However, if he had stayed only with his personal experience, the best he could have done was perhaps develop a cult following. So, writing was part of this abstracting ability. One of the early things that he wrote, to share his experience and his love of the culture and his feel for the kingdom of fairy, he wrote a book called Folk Tales of Irish Peasantry. He gave recognition to the common person. The moon indicates the common person. But he then began to depersonalize it by making it literature. He carried on the abstraction of his interest in Irish culture throughout life. It became more and more abstract, more and more rarefied, and more universalized until fairly late in his life, he wrote a book of poetry called The Wanderings of Oisin, which covers all of classic mythology, and it's not easy poetry to read at all. It's very hard poetry to read. However, this is the interesting thing. Even though he has his roots in common people, and he goes to very hoity-toity things, he always returns to the common. And when he comes back to the common, it's always practical. And so he returned to folklore to write a children's book. It was called Irish Fairy Tales. We're going to come back to this when we get to his mentality. But there is a trait that applies to his personality that is worth or wise to mention in passing. The airy signs are not only dry or drying to the watery emotions, they are also very subtle. They are so subtle, they're probably the most subtle of all of the four triplicities. Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I. But when the trees are bending down, we know the wind is passing by. It's an old children's, one of the poems that I learned in grade school, and it stayed with me. Air sign personalities are not easy to understand because of this subtlety. Now, fire is invisible too, but it's way too dramatic. You can't ignore or deny the fiery signs. Because we can see right through air, we sometimes mistakenly think there's nothing there. Not even the things that are presented to us out of the air. What is there in the air is so subtle that we walk right through it, and we don't often get it. Now, if you want to understand the airy sign nature of Yeats, read, there's a history of the correspondence between Yeats and Ezra Pound. And Ezra Pound was a very deep poetic contemporary of Yeats. They were friends. Pound even taught Yeats how to fence, and they fenced together. Pound went so deep he went insane. Yeats is deep. He's Saturn deep. But when you read his letters, they're not complex. Depth and knowledge, no matter how great it is, doesn't have to be complex. They're not heavy. They're not cumbersome. They're very terse, but they're not so dense that you can't get through it because they're clear and to the point. So if you want to see Yeats at his airy sign best, look at some of his letters. So in that, we see a personality and a character in general that isn't preoccupied with its own thought. And it isn't trying to impress, and it isn't trying to show how much it knows. Instead, there's clarity. It's a personality that really wants to communicate and takes things that are in common. Now, even if you take his very abstract poetry, it's like that, but it's very difficult sometimes. I'm going to read one example of his abstract and deep poetry, and it's probably his most famous. Oh, somebody changed the pages on me here, did they? Oh, no. Oh, here it is. It's a poem called Leda and the Swan. It's a very short poem, which is about the only kind I dare read. The story, it's taken from mythology. Zeus falls in love with Leda, and he takes on the form of a swan, and he ravishes her. And she becomes pregnant from that ravishment, and she lays an egg. And the egg, when it is hatched out, has 3 children. One is Castor, the twins Castor and Polydeuces, and the third one is Helen of Troy. And so there's all of that, the whole Trojan War as a result of that myth. Plus there's an even deeper side yet, and that is in all spiritual mythology, the swan always indicates the initiate. It indicates the divine power having come in and taken over the personality in such a way that a person ever after is a divine being. So all of those things are there. It's a short poem. I'm not sure that I can read it well, but I'll try. Leda and the Swan. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by dark webs, her nape caught up in his bill. He holds her helplessly, breast upon his breast. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? How can the body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof in power, and Agamemnon dead, being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, and she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop. Very good poem. Even though my reading of it isn't the best. I have another one to read later on, but I don't know if I'll dare try it because it's long and very difficult. Oh, I should have brought another
So
one.
what was the reference to Agamemnon?
Agamemnon died when he came home from the Trojan War.
Yeah. So what did it have to do with leader? And
Well, if he had never gone to war, he was gone for
okay.
something like 26 years. His wife, he sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia
yeah,
in order to get the winds, because they were 12 years waiting for the winds to take them to Troy, which is not unusual because you're going east and it's hard to get easterly winds. Winds don't take you to the east. And so he sacrificed Iphigenia because the oracle said, if you sacrifice your daughter, you'll get the winds. And he did, and they did. And then they had a long war. And after the war was over, she had taken up with another man. And both because he had killed the daughter and she was in love with another man, she had lookouts. And the moment he came in the castle, he murdered her. And Orestes had to murder his own mother to avenge his father, and Eurydice followed him for years afterwards. And the whole thing. What?
tragedy. So what they're suggesting is that because of the swan, leader and the swan,
Yeah,
he's pulling in the entire Trojan War.
Yes.
Helena's war.
Yes.
Okay, that's
he's
what I wanted to
commenting
know.
on whether
Yeah.
humans can know divine knowledge. And he's commenting on the fact that in intercourse, you don't know what the consequences of it are going to be.
Yeah.
And you better be respecting of them because they're going to have powerful consequences. All right. So you see how broad his personality was. Let's look at another stem that comes from the same root crown. He was born in Ireland, and he spent most of his early formative years there. And since he has the moon in the first house, he probably considers it both his personal environment and his general environment. He probably, with the moon in the first house, considers it his motherland. Not his fatherland, but his motherland. He was very close with his mother. He didn't have bad relationship with his father. He was close with his mother and the maternal family. He was attuned to them. When you have the strong Saturn effect and influence on the ascendant in the whole chart, he took the traditional family's values extremely well. They were a merchant family that was distinguished, and it had been recognized by all of the people for several generations. So they and their influence came to mean Ireland to him. Not just the mythical Ireland that he carried around in his soul, and not just the literary or patriotic or poetic Ireland that he shared in his literary works and with his peers, but being an air sign humanist on all levels of his being, he loved the Irish people. His attachment was to his Irish common people. He wrote his tales for peasants. It wasn't just an Arthurian romance. It was because he loved the general public, which you'd expect with the moon in the first house. But despite all of that, it didn't take on the lunar sentimentality. The moon is usually a very sentimental planet, but in the airy signs, not so much so. He was, in his love for the country and for the people of the country, he was very patriotic. He was political. Since his love was for the people and the culture, he wanted it to keep its flavor. He wanted it to keep its uniqueness. He didn't want it to become too British. And that means he was an Irish nationalist. So, an Irish Republican. So this was the nationalism of the last half of the 19th century in Ireland. And it flourished before the abstract political idealisms that covered the world. Until the USSR and the spread of communism, there were all kinds of nationalisms. There were all kinds of separate ethnic groups. And it took something like the totalitarianism of Russia to subdue these nationalisms. Even the myth of democracy, which in the United States has been perverted into an oligarchy, a multinational capitalistic oligarchy, it subdues any too much ethnicity in the United States. So in his time, there was a lot of nationalism. And nationalism is separate. It's a Jehovistic outlook with race spirits and guiding spiritual beings and things like that. Now, even though he has Aquarius rising, because he responds a lot to the Saturn side of the Aquarius, which is extremely dominant, he doesn't mind separation of culture from culture or segregation of thought from thought. So, at first he was a cultural conservative. And with his national or Irish societies that he formed, he always had an independent Ireland in mind. He was sympathetic with almost all of the nationalistic causes and the heroes and the martyrs. He writes poems to them in their honor. And for a while, he was even a fascist. He belonged to the Blue Shirt League for a short time. However, since Pluto is as weak as it is and Saturn is as strong as it is, his conservatism was Saturnian, and it wasn't like the Plutonian fascism that we saw with Mishima. So he was a conservative in that he tried to conserve what was good from the past in terms of culture. He did not unrealistically want to go back to a past that never existed, because that would be what the Plutonian side would be like. That would be fictitious. What is that supposed to kick into the answering machine? There. Now, because over the centuries, Ireland and England both spoke a common language, they couldn't be kept apart forever. There were, and there still are, some movements to learn Gaelic, but they've never been really strong. Now, since he was a man of English letter, and he had a lot of intellectual friends on both sides, friends are very influential to Aquarius rising. So he could never become too extreme or remain extreme for too long. And because he was Saturnian and not Plutonian, the Saturn again proved to be the turning point. Most of the extreme Irish nationalists were racists, and they were extremely prejudiced. And since he was a humanitarian, he couldn't stand for that. And so he took the Saturnine route, and he just withdrew his influence because he wasn't going to be part of that. So he still believed in the nationalism and in the republic, And he still stayed active, but he just wouldn't have anything to do with the prejudice and that kind of extremism. In fact, he was, later on, when the whole matter was resolved, in Ireland, he was a senator in the 20s. This is a busy, busy man. So as in his literary evolution, he followed his intellectual development, which was basically Saturnian in its depth and in its judgment. It was Aquarian broad, and Saturn sextiles Jupiter, so it was broad in that sense. So, as with the literary things, he was deep, and that brought him to things that were lofty and that were broad. So he was not, nor could not be, a political extremist, and again, he was pragmatic. Just as when he goes back to write a children's book, something that is useful, he always goes back to something that is usable. Saturn and the Moon are both primitive planets. And no matter how airy or how intellectual he became, he never left the primitive things behind. That's not to say that he was crude or anything like that, but he always went back to the primitive roots of things. Now, spiritual endeavor is the final stem that we're going to look into that was with him from his early childhood and the developmental years of his personality and on into his general character. As far as its breadth and its far-reaching qualities, it is probably the most important part of his character. It follows the same pattern that the other directions that we've looked at have followed. Now that's very important. It shows a well-developed personality that can use the same tools in many things. We're talking about the grand trine mostly, but it's a tool that he used in literature, it's in his love for the people, and now we see it in spiritual things also. The fact that the pattern has more of a vertical spectrum than a horizontal spectrum. He didn't try to understand universal knowledge on broad, but that he always tried to understand it by going deeper and higher into things, shows that this is the Saturnian depth becomes a dimensional principle as far as the direction of character development is concerned. It's very important when you work astrologically to recognize patterns like this. This is why it's important to interact with someone. Because when you see a pattern like this, you have some idea of something that you can use to apply to some other area with which the person's having trouble. So both of these, so this is both practical and important. Well, it's going much faster than I thought it would. Lucky for you guys.
5 of 16, huh?
No, we're on 5 out of 6.5. 5.5. Well, no, actually, full 6. We're doing 7. We're doing 7. We mentioned it earlier, but from childhood on, he was involved in psychic phenomena. With his relatives, they always played telepathy games. He tried as a child to actually enter into the fairy world. But he was an intellectual, a thoroughgoing intellectual, and probably one of the most intellectual individuals that we're ever going to encounter. So as he matured and as his intellect developed, he moved into larger and sometimes more indirect ways of dealing with psychic phenomena and spiritual phenomena. He studied astrology. He studied and tried to practice all of the written about forms of magic known in his time. He was in the Golden Dawn, and he participated in several groups that practiced magic. He found most of them wanting, but he did not disbelieve, he just didn't like the groups. It's ironic, but the very developments in his character are counterproductive to these very cherished ends in psychic phenomena and magical phenomena that he wanted to become accomplished. This is especially the case. Usually, the more intellectual one becomes, the more one turns off natural sensitivity and receptivity, especially if you are a questioning individual. And Saturn was pretty questioning for him. So he was very analytic in questioning of clairvoyance, and that is not a common bedfellow with clairvoyance. So it's possible with very great and sustained effort that one can have and develop a controlled sensitivity and a divine seership that is in no way incompatible with an intellectual nature. But that's not the route he chose to follow, and it's a very difficult route even with somebody with his discipline. The air signs often function indirectly in other things beyond writing. Writing is a good example, and that's the case with Yeats. He persisted with Aquarian and with Saturnian persistency in everything that he worked with in his life, and that includes psychic phenomena. Right after he was married, he and his wife discovered that she had a sensitivity and a passivity that suited automatic writing. Do you all know what automatic writing is? Automatic writing is when you put yourself in a passive state and you let some being take your hand and write. Most of it's gibberish. It's a dangerous and a negative path that often leads to mediumship. And if you allow yourself to become more and more passive, it can even lead to spirit possession and even worse things. The problem is that the very passivity that makes the phenomenon possible negates the possibility of controlling it. You don't have the ability to choose who's going to write through you, or you can't veto if you're putting yourself in a passive state. That's the problem with it all. Most often, it's lowbrow entities or entities that have other ends in mind beyond mere communication. So you find automatic writing with bad grammar and grandiose world schemes are fairly common things. But for Yeats and his wife, they were fortunate. There was no personality degradation, and what came through his wife was actually pretty good information, which is the rare exception. What came through is a study of the lunation cycle. The two forces of the sun and the moon and how they interact and what they produce on each of the 28 days from new moon back to new moon in the whole cycle. How the solar influence was maximum at the new moon and how it waned and the moon took over at the full moon, and then it waned and giving back to the sun. And so he called these. The book he wrote on it was called A Vision. And the two forces, the solar and lunar forces, he called antinomies, which is an Aries sign word if there ever was one. And the blending of the antinomies produced a specific quality for each of the 28 days. Now, when Yeats got the information, he abstracted the cycle. He quartered it, and he abstractly assigned personages from history to each of the days. He said it wasn't astrology. Well, you can use it for astrology, but he just continued the abstracting and deepening of it and making it part of the humanities, universalizing it. When he was all done, he published a book called A Vision. And immediately, he became a laughingstock of the whole intellectual realm. Laughed at somebody that would look at astrology. Previously, they had lauded him in the highest, but now he was doing something with astrology, which was an unthinkable thing. But he persisted, and he worked on quite a bit of it for the rest of his life. He even abstracted the whole system into one poem. I have the poem here. I don't know if I dare read it because it's hard reading, and I'll take one look at it. But I
read a couple stanzas.
It's called The Phases of the Moon. It starts out with an introductory poem as a preface. An old man cocked his ear upon the bridge. He and his friend, their faces to the south, had trodden the uneven road. Their boots were soiled, their Kamarama cloth worn out of shape. They kept a steady pace as though their beds, despite a dwindling and late-risen moon, were distant still. An old man cocked his ear. Ahern says, "What made that sound?" Robarty says, "A rat or water hen splashed, or an otter slid into the stream. We are on the bridge. That shadow is the tower, and the light proves that he is reading still. He has found, after the manner of his kind, mere images, chosen this place to live in, because it may be of the candlelight from the far tower where Milton's Platonist sat, or Shelley's visionary prince, that lonely night that Samuel Palmer engraved." This gets pretty heavy. But in short, he describes the 12 phases of the moon, the 28 phases of the moon, in a very quick way. It's really quite good, symbolic. He talks about, I believe, the last degree just before, when the moon is failing and falling into the sun. He calls it the degree of the hunchbacks and things like that, because everything is infused, and the people who are distorted are born at that time. It's just really, the book is quite a nice book to read. I think you can still get it. If not, you can probably get it off eBay.
Yeah, I got it at the library.
Yes.
I tried to read it in the library once.
Yeah. It's a good book. I really like it a lot. I've read it carefully a couple times.
Is it for the commoner?
Yes. Mm-hmm. This poetry is not. But
That's what I meant.
Yeah. But no matter how far-fetched, how abstract, or how universal he became, even with his poetry, he had to be practical. In this poem, as far out as it is, there was practicality. And practicality that you can use for your everyday life. My father used to collect his bills when the moon was waxing, because he knew that he would be more successful under a waxing moon than under a waning moon. When Yeats studied occult phenomena, he followed a parallel path. He began with fairy tales and folklores, and he went on to the deepest occult philosophies known to the world at that time. He was very deeply involved with theosophy and some of the similar movements of his time. He wasn't always accepted, and he usually parted ways with them after a while. And part of the reason is that he continued to question and to analyze. He wanted to keep it alive. He wanted to extend it creatively, but he wanted to keep questioning. And that didn't sit well with the people who wanted to be comfortable and accept the doctrine without too much upsetting questioning and too much investigation. Another reason why he didn't always fit in was because he was much more rigorous and universal in his humanitarian and humanistic ways. His Theosophical Society claims to have as one of its principal reasons is to find universal brotherhood of all humanity. He was stronger about that than most of the other people, and that didn't go over too well. So he was something of a fantastic intellectual, but still he was the champion of the common man. So in both of these characteristics, he may very well have been one of the most thoroughly Aquarian people since the dawning of the Aquarian age around 1850. His Aquarius rising was something of an epitome of Aquarius rising. Now the thing that seems really incongruous about this is that he was much more of a Saturnine Aquarian than a Uranian Aquarian. He was so conventional, he was unconventional, and he kept following things down to the roots, and he found those roots were something universal. So let's look a little bit at Saturn, since it is the strongest planet and certainly the ruler of the personality. Saturn is exalted in Libra. With exaltation, a special quality comes out of a planet and it becomes manifest. The regular qualities of Saturn are concentration and negation and condensation and simplification and things like that. The special quality that comes out with Saturn in Libra in its exaltation is judgment. Accurate, fair, impartial, thorough, deep judgment. A lot of people don't like judgment. They seem to confuse it with judgmentalism. They don't like the finality of judgmentalism. Who does? Judgment is not the same thing as judgmentalism because the scales keep on swaying and it keeps on going on. Saturn can be ossifying, and it can harden like that, as in judgmentalism, but in Libra, it's not likely to do so. Good, sound, fair judgment is one of the best qualities human beings possess. What we are studying right now is called, in its formal name, judicial astrology. It means that we can consider things. The word consider means to bring together the stars. Cider is like means star, and con means to bring together. And then we make a judgment from the things that are brought together on the moment or on the person's horoscope or whatever it is. Now, a lot of people don't like judicial people because they are so deliberative and because it takes time. People would rather have somebody who made snap judgments in an instant. Saturn is at rest right at that fulcrum of the scales. And in the poise of being at rest, it has something of a dignity. It has a conservative style that really befits Saturn quite well. With that poise, it can go as deep as it needs to go. And this position indicates that it knows and has a good sense of what is appropriate. How deep to go or how not deep to go. No sign has a better understanding of what is appropriate. Emily Post was a Libra. So when Saturn is there, there's that real sense of appropriateness. Saturn is in a very strong sextile with Jupiter, which greatly magnifies the judicial qualities and the good judgment. That's too much to go into now, and we're going to have to attack that at another time. Saturn is in the 8th house. Thus, there is a tendency to form judgments in secret, and that also is unnerving to some people. That guy is judging something behind his eyelids, and we don't know what it is. And there's a certain amount of unnervingness about that. However, from his life, it wasn't so much that he formed his judgments in secret. It was much more a matter of he formed judgments about secret things. It was almost always to his want to get into hidden things of life, penetrate into their inner meaning. So with Saturn as a life ruler in the 8th house, he was truly an occultist. Not necessarily in the standard way of Neptune or anything like that, but that he was truly an occultist in that he was looking for the hidden or the missing meaning behind things. Now Saturn works into the personality in two ways. First, it has the indirect influence of being the dominant co-ruler of the rising sign Aquarius. And the direct influence is through the trine to the moon, which we're going to look at now for a little bit of analysis. Moon, trine, Saturn, number 6, 158, 10%. Number 9, 45, 6%. Saturn is the number 1 planet at 301 and 18% of all planetary strength. That's a strong planet. Yeah, make yourself very cool. When we have an average planet, an average aspect, and a very strong planet, that means all of the strength of the strong planet cannot be expressed because the aspect can't handle it. So not all of Saturn is going to work out through this aspect. This means that the moon will rarely, if ever, get her way in the aspect. And the moon, sometimes being as colorless as it is, might just be nothing more than an adjunct to Saturn, a little Saturn. The moon is already out of place being in an Aries sign. Doesn't like to be there, doesn't like to be universalized. It usually likes wet, subjective atmospheres, doesn't like all that air. However, it's benign in that there is tight, positive emotional control, almost to the edge of being restricted. The moon, as we know, rules such things as emotion, imagination, fruitfulness, fretfulness, maternity, and feminine things. Saturn rules caution, coolness or coldness, concentration, control, condensation, paternity, or age. Just from the few keywords, we can see that something was obvious in his life. Emotional control. The 8th house is a house of personal reformation or of regeneration. So most of his personal regeneration was founded on absolute, unflappable emotional control. He didn't dry out all of his emotions, but he was master of his emotions in all circumstances. That's no small feat, because the moon can get excited when associated with either Uranus or Aquarius. Now, both Saturn and the Moon are producers by condensation. Saturn produces by hardening or crystallizing or precipitating or depositing or ossifying or petrifying. The Moon produces by biologically condensing and nurturing invisible imaginations into concrete forms. It holds a picture until it has consolidated. Now, the malefic aspects between the Moon and Saturn, which are not our aspect, have a special name to them. For many generations now, in traditional astrology, the afflictions between Saturn and the Moon are called Saturn hunting the Moon. This is because the progressed Saturn completes a cycle around the zodiac in over 28 years, and Saturn completes a cycle in 29 years. So any affliction between the two of them is going to move in time and stay together. Yes?
I think you said something wrong there. When you said Saturn
completes its cycle in 29 years.
Yeah, the first one you also said Saturn. Did you mean to say?
No, I said the Moon. I meant the Moon. Progressed Moon takes 28 and some tenths of a year.
Okay.
So if there is an aspect for a good part of life, a square between the two of them, that square is going to move in time. And it is said that's called Saturn hunting the Moon. What happens is, if the Moon comes along, the Moon rules, what's the right word? Development. Biological development. Each quarter of the Moon cycle is called a 7-year period called the climacterics. And every 7 years, every atom in the body changes, and there's a major change in the body. The two biggest climacterices are puberty and menopause. And so the Moon develops things. But if there is this affliction, at the same, right after the Moon develops something, Saturn comes along and just hammers it down right away. And so just when something new is coming, immediately a heavy destiny comes in, and it's a very hard thing to deal with. I've worked several times with people who have this. I find usually that the Moon square Saturn have to do with hardening conditions in the body, sometimes with not enough fluids or things like that. And the attitude that I find most associated with Saturn-Moon afflictions, especially the square, is there's some degree of idolatry of the body. That a person makes an idol of their body, and even if they're not comely people, they still idolize their body. In the case that we have a benefic aspect. And the benefic aspect shares that same special quality, that the benefic gets carried through time. Now, the Moon is a maternal planet, and Saturn is a paternal or a patriarchal or even a patronizing planet. So there is, in the positive aspects, there is an internal parenting. And so with Yeats we could say that there is an internal parenting between the Divine Father and the Divine Mother in himself, or between his external father and mother internalized. So it works similar to the way the malefic works. The Moon comes along and develops something. And then at about the same time or a little bit later, Saturn comes along and something of maturity goes along with it. A development is not the same thing as maturity, because we know that teenagers become developed, but they aren't mature about the development. But if they got the Saturn trying the Moon, there's a pretty good chance that they are, that they have some of that kind of a maturity. So what we're saying here is this kind of aspect, then, one gets control over one's life. One parents oneself. Now, if the moon is stronger, which is not our case, there are a lot of feelings, but they don't run all over the place. It's something like irrigation. There's plenty of flood water to go around and enough control to put it where it needs to go without too much of it being wasted. It's sort of with the moon, when the moon is the stronger aspect. If they are of even strength, Saturn and the moon, the emotions come together or come at the same time with the control. This is a nice, I always like the even planets because you learn how to feel and control a feeling at the same time, and that's really nice. It's a directed kind of emotionality. We have the other case. We have Saturn being much, much stronger, and so the control is the all. The control becomes the basis of emotion, becomes the basis of motivation. It's not a matter of taming emotions or controlling them, but it's a matter of being in control so that you can bring your emotions out and so that you can refine them at the same time. So you can see, especially with the Saturn being in Libra, having that cultured quality, you can see how he can bring out his emotions, especially as age comes on, and he can have the refinement and the humanity that he has. Now, this is part of a grand trine, and we'll get to the other parts of the grand trine when we come back to this chart. We have 3 more times that we're coming back to this chart, which means the last time we'll visit about 5 years from now. So, and not only is it part of a grand trine, but it's part of a double sextile trine, because both the moon and Saturn sextile Jupiter, and there's something very reinforcing when you have a double sextile trine. So right now we can see that it's the basis of regeneration, the basis of universalization and cultural expansion that has worked through every part of his life that we've looked at. And we haven't looked at all of the things of his life, but we just looked at things that were pertain to his personality. It all starts from the common moon in the first house. It starts with personal experience, and it starts with childhood experience, and it goes around the whole triangle and it comes back to the moon. It never leaves the personality. It never leaves practicality. It never leaves the immediate experience of humanity. If somebody doesn't, like in my early years, I had a really hard time with Aries sign people, and to see a personality like this, where the Aries sign people never loses its touch with the human qualities, it's really a very good thing. So it's depersonalized, and it's expanded to various degrees of universality by control and concentration and all of those things, but it never gets carried away. It never loses the feel of things through intellection. Even though some of his poems are very abstract and intellectual, they all carry a good feeling to them. So this is an extremely good Aquarian personality, the likes of which you're not likely to see again. And Ellen isn't here for 20 or 30 questions.
I'll take the place.
And that question?
Well, I was just going to make a comment. You talked about the fact that there's poise.
Yeah.
And if you look at his pictures, there isn't a single picture where he doesn't have some poise and contemplation that's emanated from those pictures,
Yeah.
And there also the other thing is that it's very contemplative. I mean, every one of them you can see his mind is just cooking,
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's interesting how some of that stuff comes
I
out.
found some better pictures later, but too late to get them printed in time. The way pictures are handled on the internet is not always an easy thing to deal with. Hey, we got this.